Hi, friends. You know, after I found my rock today, I was curious. I thought about one of the rules in our book about everybody needs a rock. And I thought about the rule about how rocks look different when you dip them in water. And then I started thinking, I wonder if rocks sink or float. And so I decided this would be a really good day to show you an experiment on sink and float. And this is something that you could do at your house with some different materials. You could use your sink or your bathtub. Bathtub was mentioned in that book too. Or a bowl. I happen to have a bowl for our experiment. Um, and I also had a little book about sink and float that I thought I would share with you. Sink or float. And that looks like a ball. And do you see how it's on top of the water? That means that ball is floating. Some things can float on the water. A boat can float. Those rhyme. A beach ball can float. Even ducks can float. Some things can sink. Hippos are heavy enough to sink in water and walk along the bottom. Have you ever visited Fiona? Did you see her walk along the bottom of her tank or of the water? Rocks are heavy. Also, they sink to the bottom. I may have gotten my answer, whether rocks sink or float, but I still want to know. I want to do an experiment. When objects sink or float, they push water away. Have you ever jumped into a pool? Your body pushed the water away as it splashed into the pool. Some things always float because they are lighter than water, like ice or wood. And some things might sink or float. Sink or float. A ship made of steel will float, but an anchor that's also made of steel will sink. One person on a raft will float, but 3 people on a raft might sink. Which things are floating? Which things have sunk? Are these 2 boys floating? That is a book about sink and float. Now we are going to conduct our experiment. So this work is on our shelf in our classroom. So when you come to school, you will be able to do this work. But at home, you could also do a work very similar to this. And I brought my rock, my special rock. It's real shiny. It has like little crystals almost. It's called a quartz. That's the one I found today. So I brought that because I really want to know if it sinks or floats. All right, so I'm going to leave my bowl on my tray. And this is called a pitcher. And in our pitcher, we are going to put some water. So I want you to just be patient, and I'm going to walk to the sink, and I'm going to fill up my pitcher with water. I'm I'm going to pour very carefully, pour my water into my bowl. Now, if something sinks, it will go to the bottom. If it floats, it will stay on top. In our book, it said that rocks are heavy and they sink. Let's see if that's true. Oh, yes, that is true. It sank all the way to the bottom. I could even hear it. So we're going to put this rock under the word sink. Sink begins with the sound S. A rubber duck. Do any of you have a rubber duck in your bathtub? They're fun to play with. Quack, quack. Let's see if he floats or sinks. Oh, look at him. He moves around. He is floating. Float begins with the sound float. Float. This is like a heavy glass ice cube. Oh, what do you think that did? Yes, it sunk. So we're going to put that with our rock under sink. This is a piece of wood. I think our book told us what wood would do, but we're going to find out for sure. What is our wood doing? Yes, it's floating. It moves freely, so it is floating. Float. This is a marble, and it's kind of heavy and solid. Let's see. I think that this is going to sink. Did it sink? Yes, it's not moving freely. Sink. So I'll put this under the word sink with my rock and my glass ice cube. It doesn't want to stay there. Maybe I can put it in there. Stay. There we go. All right. This is a golf tee, and it's made out of wood. Now, I know this piece of wood floats. So I'm thinking since this wood was floating, that this tee will float. That's my prediction. And my prediction was correct. It is floating. This is a washer. It's made of metal. It's kind of heavy. I think it will sink. Yes, it sinks. This is a boat. It's made of plastic. It's not solid. I think maybe that will float. Yes, I bet you might have a boat for your bathtub, or maybe when you go play at the pool, and it floats. My last item is a key. I know most keys are made of metal, and I'm thinking it will sink. And it does. So I'm going to put my key under the word sink. Sink and float. Please, experiment with sink and float and discover different things in your house that sink in the water or float on top. This is a good experiment, and there's lots of things to try. Oh, that's not part of my work. The rock that I found, I was just curious about it. Now, these can go back in the bowl, all of my materials. And I noticed that my tray is wet and so is my bowl. I'm going to go empty my water and get the sponge from the sink so that I can dry it. In our classroom, we have a sponge at the sink, and we use our sponge to clean up water that we might spill in our classroom. And we clean up the bowl so that it's ready and beautiful for our next friend. That sponge goes back to the sink. And this work goes back on the shelf. Sink and float. Thank you for joining me for our sink and float lesson. I hope that you find some really unique items to sink and float at your house. Thank you for joining me.